Daniel Pink is the author of 4 provocative books about the changing world of work, including the New York Times bestsellers Drive and A Whole New Mind. His books have been translated into 29 languages and have sold more than 1 million copies worldwide. In his latest work, Drive, he uses 50 years of psychological science to overturn the conventional wisdom about human motivation and argue that the carrot and stick approach has been oversold in today's workplace. Dan's articles on business and technology appear in many publications, including the New York Times, Harvard Business Review, and Wired magazine, where he's a contributing editor. Dan held his last real job at the White House, where he served from 1995 to 1997 as the chief speechwriter for Vice President Al Gore. He's also worked as an aide to U.S. Labor Secretary Robert Reich. Some of you may have seen him online, delivering his hugely popular TED Talk on motivation, and we're fortunate to have him here with us tonight. It's my honor and privilege to introduce Daniel Pink.
Thanks, John. Thanks. All right. Good afternoon. Thank you, David, for that nice introduction. Thanks to all of you for being here. I want to begin with a confession. I originally didn't want to be here. When David asked me to come here, I said no. And then I realized, then I started negotiating, and I said I would come here under 3 conditions, and I actually have the agreement here. I want to read you my 3 conditions. First, said event must be held on Saturday afternoon on a day of spectacularly good weather, but be held indoors. Second, once we're indoors, I'm just reading the agreement here, once we're indoors on a spectacularly beautiful Saturday, my session must be held in a windowless room in the sub-basement. And 3, final, non-negotiable, my session must be held immediately before the award ceremony that everyone is waiting for and the cocktail hour that everyone needs. So thank you, Dr. Ballard, for the nice time slot. But it is great to be here. I guess my message is relatively simple, which is that, and I think that you embody this, and I don't think I need to convert anybody in this room, but I think that you can actually convert others elsewhere in North America, which is this notion that a psychologically healthy workforce isn't just a nice thing to do, it's actually an effective thing to do. That there isn't this trade-off between what we think of as psychological health and what we think of as performance. And I think that's actually one of the biggest ideas happening in the world of business right now, a kind of a reawakening of a sense of humanism in business, not only because it's nice and it's kind and it's ennobling, but because it's actually effective. And all of you are on the vanguard of that. And what I want to do here in our very brief time here today is talk a little bit about that, particularly in the realm of motivation. Now here, again, I'm preaching to the saved, but I think that much of the business world is whatever the opposite of not saved is. I guess that's damned, right? Maybe not damned. Mistaken. Let's just say mistaken. There is a view out there. I think a lot of times, I study business and I study systems, and one of the things you see studying business and systems is that a lot of times we're in the grip of orthodoxies that many of us don't realize are orthodoxies. That we just do things and we think that, well, that's just the way it works, and we never scrutinize that. And that was the way that I was until I had the good fortune of going into a lot of the psychological research on human motivation and actually talking to many of the scholars who were doing that research. And I think that the story of what those scholars have done, psychologists, some sociologists, even, amazingly enough, some economists, I think that what they have done is actually, it's a story of scientific heroism in many ways. We often think of scientific heroes of people who cure diseases or invent new technologies, but I think that social scientists, many social scientists, particularly in this realm, are scientific heroes, and that they're actually giving us a new way to live better and a way to live more effectively. And I want to talk a little bit about that and tell you just about 3 studies, some of which you might be familiar with, that I think chart a new path and validate what many of these companies are doing. So let's talk about the orthodoxy. A lot of times, and again, it's delightful to be with a bunch of psychologists because I spend most of my time with business people. Business people, in general, have a view of human motivation. They sort of have a belief, a very hardcore belief in a certain kind of physics of behavior. All right? An intuitive. It's a belief that isn't often recognized as a belief because it's so intuitive. For instance, we all have an intuitive understanding of the physics of the natural world, right? So I know that if I know enough about physics that if I know that if I take 2 steps in this direction, what's going to happen? I'm going to fall down. Very good, class. It isn't as if I think consciously, oh my gosh, here in the District of Columbia, the law of gravity is vigorously enforced, therefore I cannot take another step. It's an intuitive sense of that, right? And I think a lot of us, people who don't study behavior, have an intuitive sense of behavior that I think gets them in trouble. And the intuitive sense of behavior that they have is a kind of a basic elementary laws of physics of behavior. The belief is that if you reward behavior, you get more of it, right? And if you punish behavior, you get less of it. And that's sort of intuitive sense of behavior is how a lot of people navigate their lives and even organize their companies. And as many of you know, there's a problem with that set law of physics, which is there's an important corollary to that law of physics that says that if you reward behavior, you get more, and you punish it, you get less. The important corollary, the important footnote is not always, and not nearly as much as people think. And this is a sort of an orthodoxy that I think has gripped us and that we haven't shaken off. And I want to tell you a couple of interesting studies that I think are comprehensible to people who aren't psychologists that help convince people. And then I want to connect it to some practices that are going on in companies that really challenge that orthodoxy, not for the sake of challenging the orthodoxy or being nice, but for leading to high performance. So I'm going to start out, I'm going to talk about three interesting studies here, because I think a lot of the work that social scientists do is just so glorious and so important, and as important as the physical scientists. And one of the great joys of my life as a writer is the ability to talk to some of the people doing this research and maybe try to explain it to, regular civilians who aren't immersed in the journal, aren't immersed in these journals. So let's talk about, I want to start out not talking about psychologists, because I like psychologists. Psychologists in general are very kind, interesting people. They're nice people. I want to start with a group of social scientists who maybe are a little bit less nice. A group of people who, to my mind, have ice water running through their veins. A group of people whom you definitely don't want to meet in a knife fight in an alley late at night. Right? Some of the meanest, really most cold-blooded people you'd ever encounter. Economists. Now, economists, when I studied economics, that physics of behavior was at the core of it, right? You reward behavior, you get more, you punish it, you get less. Human beings are rational calculators of their economic self-interest. Now, if that turns out not to be the case, that's a problem for economists, right? Because the starting premise of what they do is off. And so some economists have started looking at motivation. I just want to tell you one really interesting study that I wish that people in the business world would know, and maybe you can help convey that, all right? It's a group of 4 economists, really excellent economists from some of the top institutions in North America. There's a guy who was at MIT, now he's at Duke, a woman from the University of Toronto, somebody from Carnegie Mellon, some guy who's spent time at the University of Chicago. So we're talking top-flight institutions, really hard-headed economists. And what they did is they did this really interesting set of experiments. And they did them in multiple places. They did them both in Madurai, India, and in Cambridge, Massachusetts, for a whole set of reasons, in part to tease out certain cultural biases. And what they did was this. They divided people into 3 groups. Right? And they had them do a series of exercises, a series of challenges. Physical challenges, like throwing a ball through a hoop, and then also cognitive challenges. Cognitive challenges like memorizing strings of digits, alphabetizing things quickly, all the way up the cognitive ladder to ideation, creative, complex problem solving. And what they did is they incentivized people in different ways. So this group, they promised, if you're one of the top performers of everybody here, you get a small amount of money. This group, they said, if you're one of the top performers, you get more money. You get 10 times what this group is getting. And the third group, they said, if you're one of the top performers, you get a lot more money. You get 10 times what this group is getting. And in the Indian experiment, that money amounted to the equivalent of about 5 months' pay. Okay, so that's a pretty good motivator over there for these guys. And so what they wanted to see is how much performance correlated with the size of the reward, right? And obviously, this group's going to do a little bit better. Okay, this group is just throwing balls through a hoop for pennies. These guys have a chance to make some serious money. So this group is going to do a little bit better, and that's what happened. That's what happened. I'm going to read you what they said. They said, as long as, I'm quoting now, as long as the skill involved only mechanical, the task involved only mechanical skill, bonuses worked as they would be expected. The higher the pay, the better the performance. The higher the pay, the better the performance. Makes sense, right? But here's where it gets really interesting, and here's the sort of thing that shows that many of our businesses are in the grip of, again, this orthodoxy that most of us don't realize is an orthodoxy. Here's what they say, okay? For mechanical skills, bonuses worked as they were expected. The higher the pay, the better the performance. So this group with the big reward did a lot better. But here's where it gets interesting, and I just want to read this because I want to be accurate here. They say, once the task called for, I want to read it more quietly, once the task called for even rudimentary cognitive skill, that's their phrase, not mine. Once a task called for even rudimentary cognitive skill, a larger reward led to poorer performance. Now, even here, there's a murmur. Think about that. A larger reward led to poorer performance. Now, that'd be like me, in some cases, like me taking 2 steps and floating in the air, which would be totally cool if I could do that, right? But he would say, whoa, wait a second, what's going on here? This is a little bit screwy. Now, I find this, I'm glad we heard a murmur out there, because this makes me murmur even to this day. Even though I read this paper 2 years ago, I've mentioned it before, it still disturbs me a little bit. Let me read this again. A larger reward led to poorer performance. There's a gentleman, can I ask you your name, the man who I was talking about basketball with? Tell me your first name. Michael. Are you from Columbus? Okay. So Michael and I were talking beforehand, and we were talking about being sophisticated students of human behavior. We were talking about the NCAA basketball tournaments, and particularly what was going on in the Big Ten, because both of us, I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, and Michael's from Columbus, Ohio. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. Now, when I was growing up in Columbus, Ohio was an absolute hotbed of social rest. It was the most kind of quintessentially middle-class, middle-brow place that you can imagine. But there is something, and I'm sure there have been psychologists who've studied this, that is, one of the great things that psychologists know that other people don't is that people are formed in a context. That is, who you are isn't completely at your own devices, that you make decisions, that you grow, you develop, you acquire skills in context rather than in a vacuum. And so when you grow up in a place like Columbus, Ohio, that's sort of heartland of America, you're sort of imbued with a set of values that you can't shake in the way that you can't shake an accent. It's sort of, you have this kind of, in a sense, a moral accent from growing up in a place where every home, which Michael can attest to, has 2 flags in front of their house, an Ohio State flag and an American flag. And so you grow up in Columbus, Ohio, and have that kind of moral accent, and you look at this, you say, a larger reward led to poorer performance? And it seems wrong. It seems wrong not only as a matter of correct and incorrect, it seems wrong at a kind of a moral level. What? A larger reward leads to poorer performance? It seems, again, I'm going to say something offensive here, which I'll apologize for in advance. If you're from Columbus, Ohio, imbued in these kind of middle American values, the idea that a larger reward leads to poorer performance strikes me as vaguely European. I mean, that might be how it is in France, but that's not how it is here in the United States or even in Canada. And yet, this, as many of you know, is a very sturdy finding in the social science, a finding so sturdy that it's almost uncontroversial. And the finding is essentially this. If you want people to do relatively simple, straightforward things, basically what psychologists call algorithmic work, where you're following a recipe, following a set of rules, racing to a right answer, the classic kind of motivator we use in organizations, these kind of contingent, controlling, what I call if-then rewards. If you do this, then you get that. For simple, mechanical, algorithmic work, they're pretty darn good. They work pretty well. But the science is pretty overwhelming, as many of you know, that once you ask people to do more creative work, more conceptual work, solve more complex problems, that classic kind of motivator, those controlling, contingent rewards, if you do this, then you get that, they just don't work very well. They're just not effective. We see this in schools now. In the last 3 months, there have been 2 studies. What's the greatest rage in education reform now? Paper performance for teachers, all right? Study comes out of Vanderbilt in the Nashville public schools. Half the teachers given paper performance, half the teachers not. What's the difference in test scores between the 2 sets of students? None. Paper just came out this week. Harvard Economists. 200 schools trying paper performance for teachers in the New York City public school systems. No effect. No effect. Over and over and over again, we see this. If-then rewards, great for simple tasks, not so great for complex tasks. Now, here's the interesting thing. Think about the companies represented here. How many of them do you think have workers who draw, using their language here, on rudimentary cognitive skill or above? Basically, everybody in the North American workforce is drawing on rudimentary cognitive skill and above, and we have this idea that the physics of behavior are uniform and simple. Reward it, you get more. Punish it, you get less. When in fact, there's about 50 years of social science that all of you know that says, And the problem is this kind of gap between what science knows and what business does, and there's a sort of exercise in futility, because a lot of times, again, I study business, when you look at these businesses and they see these carrot and stick motivators demonstrably fail before their eyes. When we see these carrot and stick motivators fail before our very eyes, in some cases run industries or even portions of economies off the rails, when we see these carrot and stick motivators fail before our very eyes, business's response isn't to say, man, those carrot and stick motivators failed again. Maybe we should try something different. The response is to say, man, those carrot and stick motivators failed again. Looks like we need a lot more carrots. Looks like we need some more sharper, more painful sticks. And it's taking us down a misguided road. Misguided, I mean, again, there's an interesting argument to be had about whether it's morally misguided, whether using contingent rewards is somehow dehumanizing on its face. I don't even have a dog in that fight. My view is that they don't work very well for the kind of work that human beings, that Americans, North Americans are doing, and that we need a new approach. And that new approach, I think, is much more consonant with this notion that you're putting forth of psychological health. Now, let's talk about what does work, all right? And I want to give you two studies that I think chart a different way. But let's start at the outset here about money, okay? Here's the thing. Money is a motivator. Money is a motivator. That is, we can't, as much as we want to say, oh, human beings are just sort of genetically wired to follow their bliss in the absence of any kind of external reward, that just ain't true. Money is a very important motivator. This is a very important fact in understanding the workplace. Money is a very important motivator. That is a fact. That is something actually that we here in Washington call a true fact. Okay? Because in Washington, as you might have guessed, there are facts and there are true facts. And this is a true fact. This is really the case, as many of you know. And it's an interesting thing about how glorious human beings are, that human beings, I think there's an evolutionary reason for this. Human beings are exquisitely attuned to the norm of fairness, right? You violate the norm of fairness, particularly at work, it's over for you. So if you don't pay people enough, if you don't treat people adequately, if you don't compensate them fairly, you're not going to get motivation. You're going to get disengagement and the minimal amount of effort necessary for that person not to get fired. But what the research shows, as many of you know, I mean, again, I'm preaching to the saved here, is that once you pay people enough, and even in some cases pay people a little bit more than enough, there's some research from a guy who won the Nobel Prize in economics that showed the higher performing companies were paying above what's called the market clearing wage. They were paying a little bit too much. And yet those were the companies that were doing the best. In some ways, the best use of money as a motivator is to pay people enough to take the issue of money off the table. Pay people enough so they're not focused on the money, they're focused on the work. Once you do that, the work of some really, again, heroic psychologists point the way to a better approach. If you draw on the work of Ed Deci and Richard Ryan on self-determination theory, if you look at the work of Carol Dweck, if you look at the work of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, if you look at the work of a really, really interesting new generation of scholars who are doing this kind of research, you'll say, wait a second, there's a different way to do things. You pay people enough, and then you focus on different elements of work. And again, they're things that are humanistic but also effective. They're things that are psychologically healthy, and that's why they're effective. They're not a trade-off between the two. So I think there are three key elements. I'm just going to talk about two here today. It's autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Autonomy, mastery, and purpose. I want to talk about autonomy and purpose as motivators. Autonomy and purpose as motivators, and autonomy and purpose as contributors to psychological health as well. So let's talk about Just those two aspects, and I'll give you one study on each, on autonomy and purpose. Autonomy and purpose. Now, to really understand autonomy as a business matter, again, we need to take a step back. We need to look at our world somehow with fresh eyes. So in order to understand autonomy, we have to understand this very notion of management. 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 Now, let's let the word linger in the air here. How many of you flew into Reagan National Airport to come here to Washington? Okay, a lot of you. And so those of you who flew into Reagan National Airport, how many of you saw the Potomac River as you were flying in? Okay? And how many of you thought the Potomac River looked pretty cool? All right, most of you? Okay. How many of you, as you were flying over the Potomac River, said, I wonder where the Potomac River came from? Right. We don't, I mean, unless this is not the American geologist or geographer association meeting, right? Most civilians don't think about that. We say, wow, cool, a river. But we don't, because for our purposes, it's sort of always been here, right? We never say, wow, where did that come from? It's sort of always been there. And that's true of rivers in some ways. Although rivers obviously did come from somewhere. But I mean, again, that's like, there's so many things to worry about in life. That's not one of the things I'm worried about. But that's how we think of management. We think of management as something that's always been here, something that emanated from nature, something that was delivered to us from God. But that's not true. Management is simply something that some guy invented. Gary Hamel has said this very well. Management is a technology. Management is a technology. It's a technology for organizing people into productive capacities. But management is a technology from the 1850s. Now, there are very few technologies from the 1850s that we use today, right? Anybody a Washingtonian here besides me? Handful of you. Washingtonians will tell you that actually DC snow removal is one of those 1850s technologies, but so be thankful you're here on a sunny day. Because we've upgraded our technologies, right? We don't say, oh, let's build a better telegraph in 1840s technologies. We leapfrog and build better technologies that do better things. Management is a technology that was designed to get compliance. That's the purpose of management. It's designed to get compliance. It's designed to get people to do what you want them to do the way you want them to do it. We want some measure of compliance, right? But more and more, and the problem in the workplace that David was actually articulating by drawing on some of those studies and some of those data, was what we want in workplaces is not so much compliance, but engagement. We want people to be engaged. And if you look at some of the data on engagement in the workplace, it is this inexorable downward slide. People are disengaged at work. Why? I think a reason for it is that we're using the wrong technology. Human beings, you can't manage a human being into engagement. The only way that human beings engage is if they get there under their own steam. And that calls, the technology for engagement is self-direction, not management. Management, even if you oil the gears, even if you sand off the rough edges, it's still fundamentally a technology designed to get compliance. Self-direction is the technology for engagement. And that's how you engage, that's how I engage. And if you don't believe me, I mean, this is sort of an anecdotal experiment you could try. Ask somebody to describe the best boss they ever had. Ask somebody to describe the best boss they ever had. Very rarely do you hear people describe the best boss they ever had like this. Oh, let me tell you about the best boss I ever had. She was awesome. She breathed down my neck the whole time. She was unbelievably controlling. She told me exactly what to do and how to do it. When I was working for her, I was absolutely compliant. You don't hear that. Invariably, you hear the language of, you hear different language, you hear different words, but you hear the music of autonomy, self-direction, and high standards, as a matter of fact. You hear high standards and self-direction. And I think that this offers hints about how to do things that are psychologically healthier and more effective. I'm going to give you a study and then some examples here. So let me give you a very interesting study of artists, because I think that in many ways the cognitive skills of artists are the cognitive skills people need today. What do artists do? Artists give the world something it didn't know it was missing. That's the most important business skill today. Giving the world something it didn't know it was missing. I mean, give a case in point. How many of you have an iPad? A lot of you. How many of you knew 14 months ago you were missing an iPad? That ability to iterate something new, give the world something it didn't know it was missing, is I think, one of the most fundamental cognitive skills today. It's one of the most valuable cognitive skills today. But that's what artists do. Painters do that. Sculptors do that. So Teresa Mobley at Harvard Business School does this several years ago with some colleagues, did a very, very interesting study of artists, what motivates artists. And here's what she did. She got 23 artists, painters and sculptors, and she had those 23 artists randomly select 10 commissioned works and 10 non-commissioned works. 10 commissioned works and 10 non-commissioned works. Got it? And so that's 20 works, 23 artists, 460 works of art. She then presents these works of art. I think that they were mostly paintings, sculptures, works on paper. 460 works of art to a panel of art experts, museum curators, art historians, other artists, gallery owners, to say, evaluate these works of art. They don't know where these works of art came from. Here's what she found out. I'm going to quote again. She says, our results were quite startling, which is actually as exuberant as a lot of these social scientists get, as you know. Startling is at the highest emotional register. The commission, here's what she says. I want to get this right. The commissioned works were rated as significantly less creative than the non-commissioned works, yet they were not rated as different in technical quality. In other words, the commissioned works and the non-commissioned works were equal in technical quality, but it was the non-commissioned works that were invariably more creative. And the reason, as she interviewed the artists, was this notion of constraints. A few constraints were fine, but as more and more constraints were put on the commission, it ceased being that person's work. So they're technically compliant, but they're not fully engaged and they're not fully creative. The commissions where there weren't many constraints were as creative. So it had to do less with commissions per se than with constraints. But what we have is, what she found out is that non-commissioned works invariably are more creative than the commissioned works. And talk to any artist in any medium, he or she will tell you precisely that. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, here's the thing. You look at our workplaces, there's no non-commissioned work. Everything people do in organizations is commissioned work. And here we have, this research from artists that says, actually, if you want breakthrough thinking, you got to have some non-commissioned work. And I'm going to give you some examples of where the world might be going. I'll give you 4 cool examples of companies that are doing some really cool things. All right, let's start with this company here, Atlassian. Atlassian. How many have heard of this company, Atlassian? All right, looks like less than half. So let me explain. Atlassian is an Australian software company. It's an Australian software company, and they do something really cool. Once a quarter, on Thursday afternoons, they say to their software developers, go work on anything you want. Do it the way you want, do it with whomever you want, autonomy over task, autonomy over team. Do whatever you want, as long as the only thing we ask is that you show what you've created to the rest of the company on Friday afternoon in this fun freewheeling meeting. They call these things FedEx days, because you have to deliver something overnight. Exactly. It turns out that one day of intense undiluted autonomy has led to a whole array of fixes for existing software, a whole array of ideas for new products, a whole array of improvements for internal processes that had otherwise never emerged. Now, the underlying theory of motivation is very different. It isn't saying, hey, if you come up with something groovy, I'll give you a prize. It's saying, because you're a human being who wants to be engaged, you probably want to do something great. Maybe I should just get out of the way for a day. It's worked so well, in fact, that they've upped the ante to something called 20% time, where now at this company you can spend 20% of your time working on whatever you want. Now, this sounds kind of, touchy-feely, summer of love kind of approach to things. But I just want to emphasize that this is very, very muscular and very, very hard-headed. Because the companies that do this, they don't sign away the intellectual property rights to what's created during that 20% time, which is smart. As many of you know, the best-known company that does this is a company that you might have heard of called Google. All right? Google's been doing this since its inception. Google's been doing this since its inception. Look at something like Google News. I look at Google News all the time. 5 million viewers, terrified the American newspaper industry. Google News, not an official project, a 20% project. Anybody have a Gmail account? Apparently a lot of you. Gmail, not an official project, a 20% project. I got a great quote from a Google engineer. Here's what he says. Just about all the good ideas here have bubbled up from 20% time, which sort of makes you wonder what they're doing the other 80%. But in some sense, what they're doing the other 80% is commissioned work. 20% commissioned work, 80% non-commissioned work. FedEx days, 4 days a year of non-commissioned work, 361 days of commissioned work. Let me give you one example, then we'll talk about purpose, and then we'll wrap up. Really interesting example. It involves these two men, Andrei Geim and Konstantin Novoselov. Andrei Geim and Konstantin Novoselov. So I want to tell you about Andrei Geim and Konstantin Novoselov, which raises the question, who are Andrei Geim and Konstantin Novoselov? These guys won, just a few months ago, won the 2010 Nobel Prize in Physics. They are scientists, physicists at the University of Manchester in the UK. They won for isolating a substance called graphene. Right? These folks are scientific heroes too. Graphene, it's amazing. Graphene is a substance that is 1 atom thick, but has 100 times the strength of steel. I mean, it's like sci-fi. I mean, it's amazing. But obviously, enormous industrial applications for something like that. I mean, just a sort of orders of magnitude of a breakthrough in material science. All right, so Geim and Novoselov have a laboratory at the University of Manchester. And like many of you, because they're scientists, they write grants to get funding for research. They have papers due in scientific journals. But at this laboratory, each week they set aside a few hours for what they called, their words, Friday evening experiments, where a few hours a week, often on Friday evenings, they would try stuff. Explicitly not things they had funding for, explicitly not things where there was a paper due, just things that they were curious about. Now there's one sort of anthropological thing that's interesting here. This is apparently what physicists do for fun on Friday night. But leaving that aside, they made their breakthrough on graphene not in their official work, but on their Friday evening experiments. They made their breakthrough that won them the Nobel Prize in Physics. Nobel Prize in Physics. That's pretty good, right? Like if one of my kids called me up in a few years and said, hey, Dad, I won the Nobel Prize in Physics, I would say, not bad, right? They won the Nobel Prize in Physics not for their official work, not for the sanctioned work, not for the commissioned work, but for the unofficial, unsanctioned, non-commissioned work. And so I think that one of the things we can do, along with the great work that many of these companies are doing, is carve out a little space for non-commissioned work. I think that's going to lead to breakthroughs. I think it's going to increase autonomy and improve psychological health. I think it's going to lead to big results. In fact, so much so that I think my prediction is that it will become commonplace before too long, that organizations will have some amount of time for non-commissioned work. Let me wrap up on purpose, okay? Because another big, I think we've undersold purpose as a motivator. And let me give you one interesting study about this that I think really points to this. And I single it out in part because the researcher who did this is a young social scientist named Adam Grant, who's at the University of Pennsylvania. And there are this kind of new generation of scholars who are doing some really interesting work. So let me tell you about one Adam Grant piece of research, and then we'll wrap up. He did a study of, because I'm from Columbus, Ohio, I have to talk, I'm sort of hesitant to say this, but he did some research at the University of Michigan. And he did some research at the University, well, he left Michigan to go to Penn, so that's obviously an upward move. Ohio State's in the Big Ten Finals, guys. See, I guess this is sort of confirmation that sort of your milieu, if you'll pardon my French, in which you were raised, like it never really leaves you, because I'm already basically getting into an alley fight over Ohio State and Michigan. So Adam Grant does this interesting research at the University of Michigan. And he goes to call centers where people are raising money for raising funds for the University of Michigan. Those kinds of wonderful calls you get once you've paid a lot of money to go to university, asking for more money. And what he does is, in this call center, he divides people into three groups. Each night for 2 weeks before they make calls. This group, group one, is our control group. We don't do anything with them. This group, each night before they make calls, they read letters from people who had previously worked in that call center, testifying to the personal benefit of having worked there. I worked at this University of Michigan call center raising money, and I learned negotiation skills. I learned communication skills. I learned how to deal with rejection. I learned resilience. And that's been very useful to me because I'm now an account executive, or I'm now a management consultant. Okay, so basically testifying to the personal benefit of working in this call center. The third group also read letters for 5 minutes, just 5 minutes, also read letters, but these letters were from people who had benefited from the funds raised there. So they read a letter. My name is Joe Schmatz. I grew up in a small town in Michigan, and my parents couldn't afford to send me to college, but thanks to a scholarship, I was able to go not only to any college, but to the extraordinary University of Michigan, and now I'm a pediatrician. Sort of letters about the purpose. And they were told, you can't discuss these letters with the people you're calling. Cut, fade out. They look at the performance over the next 2 weeks. Again, these are not people who are getting a piece of the action. So you raise, your salaried employees. Here's what happened. I want to make sure I get this right. The difference between this group, the personal benefit group, and the control group was essentially zero, which surprises me. That the group that was reminded of it, the personal benefit of working there, didn't do any better than the control group. But this group, the group 5 minutes of reminder about the purpose of what they were doing, earned more than twice the amount of money and more than twice the amount of weekly pledges as the other two groups. Now think about that for a second. I mean, think about put yourself in the mind of an organizational consultant or a management consultant. Hey, you go to a company, hey, I've got this 5-minute intervention that can double performance. That's pretty good. I mean, you can charge a lot of money for that, right? And I think what it is that, and again, I think that one reason for the lack of psychological health in many workplaces is that as managers are obsessed with how. Here's how you do things. Here's how you do it. Do it the right way. Do it on time. Here's how you do it. But there aren't enough conversations about why. Why are we doing this in the first place? And it turns out that having a few more conversations about why can actually lift people's performance. That is, salting a few more whys. Here, let me explain why we're doing this. Can actually have this incredible upward lift on performance, and then it's a win-win game because I think it has I think performance can actually improve psychological health. I think psychological health can improve performance. And so that's what I want to leave you with here today. And sort of the one big message is this, and I think that the companies being represented here embody this, which is that there is a crying need now for people to challenge orthodoxies, a crying need for people to challenge the conventional wisdom, not in a truculent way, but in a very well-informed, very muscular way, because there are orthodoxies that are holding us back. And I think people in the social sciences, people like you, have an opportunity, but also in many ways a responsibility, to actually clarify the science for people, get them out of the grip of these orthodoxies, and allow us to build workplaces. Again, think about workplaces. We spend more than half of our waking hours at work. So they ought to be psychologically healthy. They ought to be enriching in a spiritual and psychological way. And I think if you are in this incredible position to take some of this information out there, sort of ungrip people from these orthodoxies, and I think if you do that, you can end up building workplaces that I think make companies better off, but just make people better. And that's a really cool thing. So thanks for your time.